I am continuing to dig in to the situation with the Nancy Guthrie investigation, FBI Director Kash Patel.
On a recent podcast appearance, FBI Director Kash Patel made a stunning accusation. He claimed that during the critical first 4 days of the Nancy Guthrie investigation, the Pima County Sheriff's Office deliberately kept federal agents out. He revealed that an FBI plane sat on standby, engines ready, waiting to transport DNA evidence from the crime scene in Tucson, Arizona, directly to the FBI laboratory in Quantico, Virginia. But that plane never took off. Instead, according to Patel, Sheriff Chris Nanos made the decision to send that crucial evidence to a private laboratory in Florida. The implication was clear. A local sheriff had prioritized ego over efficiency, potentially compromising a missing person investigation while federal resources sat unused. This wasn't just bureaucratic friction. This was a public call-out from one of the highest-ranking law enforcement officials in the United States, accusing a county sheriff of obstructing a federal investigation into a woman's disappearance. The story exploded across national media. But like most stories that capture headlines, the truth turned out to be far more complicated than the initial narrative suggested. If you're interested in deep dives into true crime cases that go beyond the headlines and examine the institutional failures that sometimes define these investigations, you're in the right place. Please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to True Crime Desk. Your support helps us continue bringing you thoroughly researched content that challenges simplistic narratives and seeks the truth, even when it's uncomfortable.
We have worked closely, the FBI has worked closely since the day that this happened with the local law enforcement. And there's been reports of friction. I've seen those reports. We are here to...
What makes the Nancy Guthrie case particularly compelling isn't just the mystery of her disappearance. It's the collision of federal and local law enforcement, the public airing of grievances that are usually kept behind closed doors, and the testimonies from people inside the Pima County Sheriff's Office who paint a picture dramatically different from both the FBI director's accusations and the sheriff's defenses. This is a story about institutional dysfunction, historical grudges, and the chaos that can unfold when a major investigation lacks competent leadership. Let me start by providing context for those unfamiliar with how this story reached the national spotlight. Nancy Guthrie disappeared under circumstances that immediately raised alarm. The details of her disappearance suggested foul play. Evidence collected from the scene required sophisticated forensic analysis, particularly DNA evidence that could potentially identify a suspect. In cases like this, the FBI routinely offers assistance to local agencies. They have resources, laboratories, and specialized personnel that smaller jurisdictions simply cannot match. This offer of assistance is standard procedure, not an insult to local capabilities. But according to FBI Director Kash Patel, when federal agents attempted to involve themselves in the Nancy Guthrie investigation, they encountered resistance from Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos. Patel stated publicly that the FBI was excluded from the investigation for the first 4 days. He described having resources ready, including that plane standing by to immediately transport evidence to Quantico for analysis. The decision to instead use a private lab in Florida, Patel suggested, was both puzzling and problematic. These are serious allegations. When a federal law enforcement director publicly criticizes a local sheriff by name, it signals a breakdown in relationships that typically operate with professional courtesy, even when disagreements exist behind the scenes. Patel's comments suggested not just poor judgment, but possible obstruction of a federal investigation. Sheriff Chris Nanos responded with his own statement. He disputed Patel's characterization of events. He claimed that the FBI had been involved from the beginning, pointing to what he described as an FBI task force member who had been part of the investigation since day one. He defended his decision-making and suggested that the FBI director's comments were politically motivated or based on incomplete information. So we have two competing narratives. The FBI director says his agents were shut out. The sheriff says they were involved from the start. Both are high-ranking law enforcement officials. Both have access to the same basic facts. Yet their accounts contradict each other fundamentally. This is where the story could have remained. A he-said dispute between federal and local law enforcement, with the public left to choose which authority figure to believe based on their own political predispositions or biases about federal versus local control. But then other voices began to emerge. One of those voices belongs to Sergeant Aaron Cross. Cross is not a peripheral figure. He's an active duty sergeant with the Pima County Sheriff's Office and serves as the president of the Deputies Union. This position gives him access to information from rank-and-file members who were directly involved in the investigation. It also gives him a unique perspective. He's inside the department, but represents the interests of deputies, not the command staff or the elected sheriff. Importantly, Sergeant Cross made clear in his public statements that he is no fan of Sheriff Nanos. This is crucial for assessing his credibility. When someone criticizes their own organization's leadership while still defending certain aspects of that organization's actions, it suggests they're trying to tell the truth as they understand it rather than simply covering for their boss. What Sergeant Cross revealed in interviews should concern anyone interested in how major criminal investigations are conducted. According to Cross, the first week of the Nancy Guthrie investigation was, in his words, a disaster. He didn't use bureaucratic language or diplomatic phrasing. The detectives he spoke with described it using a much blunter term. They called it a complete organizational failure, chaotic and disorganized to the point of dysfunction. Cross explained that the command staff, meaning the highest-ranking officers below the sheriff, had taken control of the investigation rather than allowing the detective units to run it according to standard investigative protocols. This might sound like an internal procedural dispute, but the consequences were significant. Detectives were being sent out to interview witnesses without any centralized tracking system to record who had already been contacted. Cross described situations where investigators would arrive at a location only to discover that the same witness had already been interviewed 4 or 5 times by different detectives who had been given the same assignment. This isn't just inefficient. It's investigatively harmful. Witnesses become frustrated, their memories become contaminated by repeated questioning, and crucial investigative hours are wasted on redundant work. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with, "I'm still here." Let's see who's truly following this shocking story. The lack of coordination wasn't limited to witness interviews. According to Cross, information wasn't being shared effectively even between different units within the Pima County Sheriff's Office itself. Detectives in one unit didn't know what detectives in another unit were doing. There was no clear investigative plan, no systematic approach, no central coordination ensuring that leads were being pursued logically and that resources were being deployed effectively. Cross stated that this internal communication breakdown was so severe that it affected every aspect of the investigation during that critical first week. If detectives within the same department weren't sharing information with each other, how could they effectively share information with outside agencies like the FBI? This is where Cross's account becomes particularly important for understanding what really happened between the FBI and the Sheriff's Office. He suggested that the FBI's perception of being deliberately excluded might have been accurate in terms of how it felt from their perspective, but the cause wasn't necessarily malicious intent. Instead, it was organizational chaos. The Sheriff's Office wasn't keeping the FBI out through some calculated strategy. They were simply so disorganized that they weren't communicating effectively with anyone, including their own personnel. Cross distinguished between 2 separate issues. First, there was Sheriff Nanos's well-documented animosity toward the FBI, which Cross acknowledged existed and which he believed did play a role in the sheriff's reluctance to hand over control of the investigation. Second, there was the sheer incompetence of how the investigation was being managed during those first crucial days. The ego issue, Cross suggested, prevented the sheriff from allowing the FBI to take the lead role in the investigation. The incompetence issue created the communication failures that made the FBI feel shut out even when that wasn't necessarily the conscious intention. This distinction matters because it changes how we understand what went wrong. If Sheriff Nanos deliberately excluded the FBI out of spite or pride, that's one kind of failure. If his command staff simply ran such a chaotic investigation that nobody, including federal partners, could get consistent information, that's a different kind of failure. Both are serious, but they have different implications. To understand why Sergeant Cross and others believe that Sheriff Nanos's personal feelings about the FBI played a role in this situation, we need to go back to 2016. That year, the FBI conducted a RICO investigation into the Pima County Sheriff's Office. RICO stands for Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations, a federal law originally designed to prosecute organized crime, but also used in cases of systematic corruption within organizations, including law enforcement agencies. The FBI's investigation focused on allegations of misuse of funds within the sheriff's office. The results were devastating. One chief was indicted on criminal charges. Another chief, facing the investigation and its implications, committed suicide. Chris Nanos, who was serving as interim sheriff at the time, was implicated in the investigation but ultimately was not charged. This was not a minor departmental scandal. This was a federal criminal investigation that resulted in an indictment and a death. It was public, it was humiliating for the department, and it was personally damaging to Nanos. In 2016, during the investigation, a local television station interviewed Sheriff Nanos about the FBI's involvement. Video of that interview still exists. In it, Nanos's contempt for the federal agents is visible. According to those who have reviewed the footage, he refers to his own personnel as the real policemen, the real detectives, with a clear implication that FBI agents don't measure up. His tone is dismissive, his body language defensive. Sergeant Cross and others within the department believe that Nanos blames the FBI investigation for his loss in the 2016 election. Whether that assessment is accurate is debatable, but what matters is that people who work with Nanos daily believe he holds a grudge against the FBI that stems from that investigation. Cross stated plainly that he believes the sheriff has not forgotten what happened in 2016. This isn't speculation from an outside observer. This is the assessment of a sergeant and union president who interacts with the sheriff and hears from deputies throughout the department. When we view the Nancy Guthrie investigation through this lens, certain decisions start to make more sense, even if they don't become more justifiable. The question of the DNA evidence and the laboratories becomes less about scientific capability and more about autonomy and control. Multiple forensic DNA experts have confirmed that many private laboratories have capabilities equal to, and in some cases exceeding, the FBI laboratory at Quantico. Some private labs have invested in cutting-edge technology that federal labs haven't yet acquired. So from a purely scientific standpoint, sending evidence to a qualified private lab rather than to Quantico might not compromise the analysis. However, there's a significant practical difference. The FBI laboratory provides its services to law enforcement agencies free of charge. Private laboratories charge for their work, often substantial amounts. For a county sheriff's office operating on a budget, choosing to pay for lab work when a free and equally capable alternative is available requires explanation. Sergeant Cross was asked directly about this decision. His response pointed back to the sheriff's relationship with the FBI. If you have a free option and a paid option that are scientifically equivalent, why choose the paid option unless there's a reason you don't want to use the free one? There's another element to this that Cross addressed. According to his conversations with detectives involved in the investigation, by the time the FBI was fully partnered with the sheriff's office in what Cross called in earnest, the DNA evidence collected from Nancy Guthrie's home had already been shipped to the Florida laboratory. So the question of whether to use the FBI plane to transport evidence to Quantico may have been moot by the time federal agents were given full access to the investigation. However, other evidence was collected later, including gloves that were found and that reportedly could have yielded important forensic information. That evidence could have been sent to Quantico, but according to available information, it wasn't. This brings us to another important voice in this story, Acting Attorney General Todd Blanche. Blanche holds a position superior to the FBI director in the chain of command. The FBI operates under the Department of Justice, and the Attorney General oversees the entire department. So when Blanche speaks about the Nancy Guthrie investigation, he's speaking as Kash Patel's boss. In an interview with a national news correspondent, Blanche was asked directly about the apparent breakdown in coordination between the FBI and the Pima County Sheriff's Office. His response was notably different in tone from Patel's public comments. Blanche stated that the FBI had worked closely with local law enforcement from the day the investigation began. He acknowledged that there had been reports of friction between agencies, but characterized these as unhelpful distractions. He emphasized that the Department of Justice was in a cooperative mode with local law enforcement and that the goal was to work together, not to fight over jurisdiction. When asked whether the FBI should take over the investigation, Blanche demurred. He said that investigations like this should use a coordinated approach, with each agency contributing its particular strengths and resources. He specifically noted that local law enforcement has tools and knowledge that the FBI doesn't have, just as the FBI has capabilities that local agencies lack. This is a dramatically different message from Patel's accusation that the sheriff's office had kept the FBI out for 4 days and made decisions that seemed designed to exclude federal involvement. Why would the acting attorney general and the FBI director, both senior officials in the same administration, both involved in the same case, present such different characterizations of the situation? There are several possible explanations. Blanche might be trying to calm a public dispute that he believes is counterproductive to the investigation. Patel might be responding to genuine frustration from FBI agents on the ground who felt obstructed. They might have different information. They might have different priorities. Or they might both be telling the truth as they understand it, with Blanche taking a diplomatic institutional view and Patel representing the operational frustrations of his agents. What's clear is that even at the highest levels of federal law enforcement, there isn't a unified narrative about what happened in Tucson. Sergeant Cross offered his interpretation of this contradiction. He suggested that FBI agents likely did feel excluded during those first few days. Their perception that they were being deliberately shut out was probably genuine. But Cross maintained that this perception, while understandable, was based on incomplete information about what was actually happening inside the sheriff's office. The FBI saw a local agency that wasn't communicating with them, that seemed to be making decisions without consultation, and that appeared to be avoiding federal involvement. Given Sheriff Nanos's history with the FBI, agents might have reasonably concluded that they were being frozen out intentionally. But according to Cross and other sources within the department, the communication failures the FBI experienced were the same communication failures happening internally. This wasn't the sheriff's office competently running an investigation while deliberately excluding federal partners. This was an investigation being run so poorly that nobody had good information, including the people supposedly in charge. Cross pointed to a bizarre incident that perfectly illustrated the level of confusion during the early days of the investigation. A witness in the Nancy Guthrie case, a family member of a neighbor, was interviewed by someone identifying themselves as an FBI agent. After this interview, the witness became suspicious and reported to the sheriff's office that they believed they had been contacted by someone impersonating a federal agent. The sheriff's office responded by launching an investigation into this report. Deputies conducted a full forensic response at the witness's home, including fingerprinting, trying to identify this supposed imposter who was claiming to be FBI while investigating the Guthrie case. After this investigation consumed time and resources, they determined that the person who had interviewed the witness was, in fact, a legitimate FBI agent. Think about what this incident reveals. During a major missing person investigation with a potential homicide suspect at large, the sheriff's office didn't know that FBI agents were conducting interviews related to the case. The internal communication was so poor that when a witness reported contact with an FBI agent, the sheriff's office treated it as a possible crime rather than recognizing it as part of the federal assistance that was supposedly being coordinated. Sergeant Cross called this incident a huge waste of bandwidth. Resources that should have been focused on finding Nancy Guthrie or identifying her attacker were instead spent investigating a law enforcement partner's legitimate activities because nobody had bothered to ensure that all the agencies involved knew what each other was doing. Cross said that detectives described feeling like they were going in circles. They weren't being given the autonomy to pursue the investigation according to their professional judgment and training. Instead, they were receiving what Cross characterized as orders from command staff, being sent on what he called little side quests rather than being allowed to develop and execute a coherent investigative strategy. This kind of micromanagement from brass, meaning high-ranking officers, is generally considered poor practice in criminal investigations. Detectives are trained specialists. They know how to build cases, how to prioritize leads, how to manage evidence. When command staff overrides detective judgment and starts issuing direct orders about specific tasks, it usually indicates either a lack of trust in the detectives or a desire by leadership to control the investigation for reasons other than investigative efficiency. In the Nancy Guthrie case, according to Cross, this command-level control contributed to the organizational chaos. There was no steady hand at the wheel, no experienced investigator managing the flow of information and the deployment of resources. Instead, there were commanders giving orders, detectives trying to follow those orders, and no effective system for tracking what had been done, what needed to be done, or what different personnel were doing at any given time. Sheriff Nanos, in his response to the FBI director's criticism, claimed that there had been an FBI task force member involved in the investigation from the very beginning. This statement was technically accurate but misleading. Investigative reporting into this claim revealed that the person Nanos was referring to was not an FBI agent assigned to the case. Instead, it was a Pima County Sheriff's Office detective who had been tasked out to a federal agency as part of a different assignment. Law enforcement agencies sometimes assign their personnel to work with federal task forces on an ongoing basis. These deputies or detectives help federal agencies with cases that have local components, sometimes assisting with writing state-level search warrants for federal investigations or providing local knowledge and connections. The detective that Sheriff Nanos referenced apparently fell into this category. This person may have been present at the scene early in the investigation and may have relayed some information, but this was not the same as the FBI being a full partner in the investigation from day one. This kind of technically true but substantively misleading statement is common in disputes between institutions. It allows an official to claim they didn't lie while still creating a false impression. Sheriff Nanos could say there was an FBI task force member there from the beginning without mentioning that this person was actually a sheriff's office employee who happened to work with a federal agency on unrelated matters. As the investigation progressed and as the public attention intensified, a formal task force was eventually established. This task force included federal agents working alongside local detectives. But according to multiple sources, this formalization came later than it should have, delayed by the organizational dysfunction and possibly by the sheriff's reluctance to cede any control to federal authorities. Sergeant Cross was asked directly whether he believed the investigation should have been turned over to the FBI. His answer was unequivocal, absolutely. He pointed out that FBI Director Patel had stated publicly that hundreds of agents were available to assist with the case. The Pima County Sheriff's Office has 96 detectives total, and obviously not all of them could be assigned to a single case. Even if every detective in the department had been put on the Nancy Guthrie investigation, they would have been outnumbered by the federal resources that were being offered. Beyond simple numbers, Cross expressed confidence that the FBI would have had better organizational systems for tracking an investigation of this scale. The chaos that characterized the first week under Sheriff's Office leadership suggested that the department simply wasn't equipped to manage an investigation that had become nationally significant and that required the coordination of multiple agencies and hundreds of potential leads. Cross identified a specific moment when he believed the decision to hand over control should have been made. When video footage was released showing a perpetrator on Nancy Guthrie's doorstep, the investigation shifted. What had been a missing person case with suspicious elements became clearly a violent crime with video evidence of a suspect. At that point, Cross argued, the sheriff's office should have stepped into a support role and allowed the FBI to take the lead. That decision wasn't made. The sheriff's office maintained control. The investigation continued under local leadership, with federal agencies participating but not directing.
Do you think that the FBI should take over the investigation?
Well, I don't think or not think that. I think that any investigation like this should be done by a coordinated approach, right? There's tools that the local law enforcement has that the FBI doesn't have. There's tools that the FBI has that local law enforcement doesn't have. So in any investigation like this, it's not somebody taking over or taking a back seat. It's working together to solve the crime.
Sergeant Cross described the current atmosphere within the department regarding the case. Outside of the task force itself, he said, it's largely business as usual. Deputies not directly involved in the investigation aren't talking about it constantly. There's no significant buzz within the department about breaks in the case or new developments. This could mean one of two things. It might mean that the task force is now functioning properly and maintaining appropriate operational security, not sharing information broadly within the department to prevent leaks. Or it might mean that there simply haven't been significant breaks in the case to discuss. Cross acknowledged that he couldn't say which interpretation was correct. He didn't have detailed knowledge of the task force's current activities. But the lack of information flowing through the department stood in contrast to the chaos of those first days when, ironically, information wasn't being properly controlled or shared, but everyone seemed to be talking. What are we to make of all this? The Nancy Guthrie investigation appears to be a case study in how institutional dysfunction can create confusion that looks like malice, and how historical animosity can influence decisions in ways that may compromise current cases. FBI Director Kash Patel's accusation that the sheriff's office kept federal agents out for 4 days appears to be accurate from the perspective of FBI agents on the ground. They were not given full access. They were not made partners in the investigation immediately. They were not able to utilize the resources they had made available. Sheriff Chris Nanos's claim that the FBI was involved from the beginning appears to be technically accurate in the narrowest sense, but substantively misleading. Having a sheriff's office detective who works with a federal task force on other matters present at a scene is not the same as coordinating with the FBI on the investigation itself. Acting Attorney General Todd Blanche's more diplomatic characterization of the situation as a cooperative effort appears to be either an attempt to smooth over a genuine dispute for the sake of ongoing investigative work, or a view from his level that doesn't capture the operational frustrations that Patel was expressing. And Sergeant Aaron Cross's account suggests that the truth contains elements of all these perspectives. There was ego. There was historical animosity. There was a sheriff who didn't want to give up control to an agency he resented. But there was also simple organizational failure, poor leadership, inadequate tracking systems, and communication breakdowns that affected everyone involved in the investigation. The consequence of all this institutional drama is that a woman remains missing. Nancy Guthrie's case became a national story not because of a breakthrough in finding her or identifying her attacker, but because of a public fight between law enforcement agencies about who should be leading the search. The question of the DNA evidence and the laboratories may never be fully resolved to everyone's satisfaction. Experts agree that qualified private labs can do work equivalent to Quantico. But the optics of choosing a paid lab over a free federal lab, when you have a documented history of conflict with the FBI, will always raise questions about motivation. The question of whether the first 4 days of chaos materially harmed the investigation is also difficult to answer definitively. In missing person cases, particularly those involving violence, the first hours and days are critical. Leads go cold quickly. Witnesses' memories fade. Physical evidence degrades or is lost. Whether the disorganization that Sergeant Cross described resulted in missed opportunities or lost evidence may never be known. What is known is that when a major investigation begins with what people inside the department describe as complete organizational failure, when detectives are interviewing the same witnesses multiple times because nobody is tracking who has been contacted, when agencies are investigating each other's legitimate activities because communication is so poor, something has gone fundamentally wrong. The Nancy Guthrie case deserved better. It deserved a coordinated response from the beginning. It deserved leadership that put investigative effectiveness above personal grievances. It deserved agencies working together seamlessly rather than fighting over jurisdiction and control. Whether that coordination and cooperation ever fully materialized, even after the initial chaos, remains an open question. The investigation continues. The task force operates. But the public disputes between the FBI director and the local sheriff have created doubt about whether this case has received the professional, organized, resource-rich investigation that a missing woman and her family deserved from day one.
The FBI has worked closely since the day that this happened with the local law enforcement. And there's been reports of friction. I've seen those reports. We are here to help. And the FBI, President Trump authorized and directed us to do everything that we can to help that investigation. This is at its heart a local investigation because of the nature of this type of potential crime. But the FBI remains exactly where we've been, which is we're ready, willing, and able to help as much as we can. We don't like interagency squabbles. Nobody likes that. That doesn't help the investigation. But we are in a complete cooperative mode with the local law enforcement.
Do you think that the FBI should take over the investigation?
Well, I don't think or not think that. I think that any investigation like this should be done by a coordinated approach, right? There's tools that the local law enforcement has that the FBI doesn't have. There's tools that the FBI has that local law enforcement doesn't have. So in any investigation like this, it's not somebody taking over or taking a back seat. It's working together to solve the crime.
This is the part of the story that often gets lost when true crime becomes entertainment. Behind the institutional drama and the public accusations and the historical grievances, there's a human being whose fate remains unknown. There's a family seeking answers. There's a community that deserves justice and safety. When law enforcement fails to coordinate effectively, when ego and grudges influence operational decisions, when organizational dysfunction creates chaos during critical early stages of an investigation, it's not just an administrative problem. It's a moral failure with real consequences for real people. If you found this deep dive into the institutional failures surrounding the Nancy Guthrie investigation valuable, please consider liking this video and subscribing to True Crime Desk. We'll continue following this case and bringing you updates as new information becomes available. We focus on the questions that matter, the systemic issues that affect how justice is pursued, and the human cost when institutions fail to function as they should. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next investigation.